The funeral director's hands trembled as he tried to explain why the casket shouldn't be opened. His words floated around me like autumn leaves, meaningless and distant. Through the fog of my grief, I could see Richard standing by the chapel entrance with her, a woman whose name I'd never learned but whose perfume I'd smelled on his shirts for months. My son lay in that polished mahogany box, and my husband had brought his mistress to mourn him. But what I found when I finally pried open that casket would shatter everything I thought I knew about death, love, and the thin membrane between sanity and madness. The morning Michael died, I was arranging flowers in the kitchen, white roses from our garden, the ones he'd helped me plant 3 springs ago when he was still small enough to believe in magic. The stems were imperfect, some bent, others shorter than I'd planned, but I'd learned to love imperfection. It was the only way to survive 17 years of marriage to Richard. The call came at 11:47 a.m. I remember because I was staring at the clock, wondering if I should start lunch early, when the hospital's number flashed on my phone screen. Dr. Martinez's voice was professional but strained, the way doctors sound when they've delivered this news too many times. Car accident. Instantaneous. No suffering. The roses fell from my hands, scattering across the kitchen floor like broken promises. I watched them lie there, their white petals bruising against the tile, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not break. Breaking implies violence, suddenness. This was more like a slow dissolution, the way sugar disappears into hot water. Richard arrived home 3 hours later, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled in that way that meant he'd been running his hands through it. He did that when he was nervous, though I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him nervous about anything involving our family. "Margaret," he said, and I knew from his tone that he already knew. I came as soon as I heard. I was still on the kitchen floor, gathering the scattered roses. Some of their petals had torn, and I found myself trying to piece them back together, as if fixing flowers could somehow repair the gaping hole that had opened in the world. "Where were you?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. "At the office." His answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. "I was in a meeting." I wanted to ask which meeting, with whom, but exhaustion had settled over me like a heavy blanket. The roses were beyond saving, their beauty temporary and fragile, like everything else I'd ever loved. The funeral arrangements consumed the next 3 days. Richard handled most of it, speaking to the funeral director in hushed tones while I sat in their sterile office, surrounded by pamphlets about eternal rest and celebrating life. The man behind the desk had kind eyes and the sort of gentle voice that probably worked well with the newly bereaved, but I found myself studying his hands instead of listening to his words. They were soft hands, manicured, the hands of someone who'd never dug a grave or carried a casket. They reminded me of Richard's hands, before he'd started working out, before he'd developed calluses from whatever he did during those long absences he claimed were work-related. "Mrs. Winters? Did you have a preference for the viewing arrangements?" I looked up to find both men staring at me expectantly. The funeral director's expression was patient, practiced. Richard's was harder to read, a mixture of impatience and something that might have been guilt. "I want to see him," I said. Richard shifted in his chair. "Margaret, are you sure that's wise?" Dr. Martinez said the injuries were extensive. "I want to see my son." The funeral director cleared his throat. "Of course, Mrs. Winters. However, given the nature of the accident, we would recommend a closed casket service. It's often easier for families to remember their loved one as they were." "But I can see him if I want to?" "Well, yes, but then I want to see him." Richard's hand found mine, squeezing it in what I supposed was meant to be a comforting gesture. His skin felt cold, foreign, like touching a stranger. "Let's discuss this at home," he said, his voice carrying that edge of authority he used when he wanted to end a conversation. But I was already standing, already walking toward the door. Behind me, I heard Richard apologizing to the funeral director, making excuses about grief and shock and the need for time to process. I let his words wash over me as I stepped outside into the harsh afternoon sunlight. The world looked different now. Colors seemed muted, sounds distant. Even the air felt thinner, as if Michael's absence had somehow altered the atmosphere itself. I walked to my car, got in, and drove home in silence, my mind empty except for the single, repeating thought, "I want to see my son." Richard found me in Michael's room that evening, sitting on his bed, holding the stuffed elephant he'd had since he was 2. The elephant was gray and worn, one ear slightly more loved than the other, patches of fur missing where small fingers had rubbed it for comfort. "We need to talk about tomorrow," Richard said from the doorway. "Tomorrow? The funeral? Margaret, you can't make a scene." I looked at him then, really looked at him? When had the lines around his eyes become so deep? When had his jaw taken on that sharp, defensive angle? A scene. You know what I mean. All this talk about opening the casket, about seeing him. It's not healthy. It's not what Michael would want. What Michael would want. The words came out sharper than I intended. Michael is dead, Richard. He doesn't want anything anymore. He flinched at that, actually stepped back as if I'd struck him. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding. I'm worried about you, he said finally. Are you? I turned the elephant over in my hands, studying its worn patches. When did you start worrying about me? What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. Everything. I don't know anymore. He came into the room then, sat on the edge of Michael's desk chair. It was a gesture meant to show solidarity, but it felt like an invasion. This was Michael's space, sacred ground, and Richard's presence here seemed wrong somehow. I know you're grieving, he said. I am too. But we have to be strong for each other. We have to get through this together. I nodded, but I wasn't really listening. I was thinking about the woman I'd seen him with at the grocery store 2 weeks ago, how they'd stood too close together in the produce section, how she'd laughed at something he said with the easy intimacy of shared secrets. I was thinking about the late nights, the weekend conferences, the way he'd started showering as soon as he came home from work. I want to see him, I said again. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then, okay, if that's what you need. But I could hear the reluctance in his voice, the way the words seemed to stick in his throat. I could see it in the way his hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, in the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. What aren't you telling me? I asked. Nothing. I'm not. There's nothing to tell. It was such an obvious lie that I almost laughed. Almost. But laughter seemed like a betrayal of the grief that had taken up residence in my chest. So I simply nodded and turned back to the elephant. Richard left me alone after that, claiming exhaustion. I heard him moving around downstairs, heard the clink of ice in a glass, the low murmur of a phone conversation. I didn't try to listen. I didn't want to know who he was talking to, or what promises he might be making. Instead, I sat in my dead son's room, surrounded by the detritus of a life cut short. Textbooks he'd never read, clothes he'd never wear, a college acceptance letter he'd never use. The elephant watched me with its button eyes, patient and understanding in the way that only inanimate objects can be. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through Michael's window, and I could hear Richard moving around downstairs, getting ready for the funeral. The elephant was still in my arms, its familiar weight a small comfort in a world that had suddenly become alien. Today I would bury my son. Today I would say goodbye to the only person who had ever loved me without reservation, without condition, without the weight of disappointment and unmet expectations. Today I would finally see what my husband had been so desperate to keep hidden. The funeral home smelled of lilies and industrial carpet cleaner, a combination that would forever remind me of this moment. Mourners filled the folding chairs in neat rows, their faces arranged in appropriate expressions of sympathy. I recognized most of them, neighbors, family friends, colleagues of Richard's who'd met Michael at company picnics and Christmas parties. But I didn't recognize the woman sitting in the third row, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, her black dress impeccably tailored. She sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, her attention focused on the closed casket at the front of the room. Richard moved through the crowd like a politician, shaking hands, accepting condolences, playing the role of grieving father with practiced ease. I watched him from my position near the guest book, noting how his smile never quite reached his eyes, how his responses seemed rehearsed. "I'm so sorry for your loss," said Mrs. Henderson from down the street, her voice thick with genuine emotion. "Michael was such a bright boy, always so helpful when he saw me struggling with my groceries." I nodded, accepting her hug, but my attention kept drifting to the woman in the third row. She hadn't moved since I'd first noticed her, hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't even reached for the box of tissues on the chair beside her. She simply sat there, watching the casket with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Margaret." Richard appeared at my elbow, his hand settling on my shoulder with what I supposed was meant to be a comforting weight. "The service is about to begin." I let him guide me to the front row, to the seats reserved for immediate family. The casket loomed before us, its polished mahogany surface reflecting the overhead lights. It was beautiful in its way, expensive and dignified, but it was also a barrier between me and my son. The minister began speaking, his voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. He spoke of Michael's kindness, his intelligence, his bright future cut tragically short. The words were true but felt hollow, like echoes in an empty house. I tried to focus on what he was saying, tried to find comfort in the familiar rhythms of grief and remembrance. But my attention kept wandering to the woman in the third row, to the way she sat perfectly still, to the way she seemed to be waiting for something. Halfway through the service, I felt Richard tense beside me. I followed his gaze and saw that the woman had shifted in her seat, was now looking directly at us. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a knowing, a recognition that made my stomach clench. The minister asked us to bow our heads in prayer. I closed my eyes, tried to summon words of comfort or hope, but found only emptiness. When I opened them again, the woman was gone. Where did she go? I whispered to Richard. Where did you go? The woman in the third row. The one in the black dress. Richard's face went pale. I don't know what you mean, but I could see it in his eyes, the panic, the guilt, the desperate hope that I would let this go. I could see it in the way his hands trembled as he reached for his program, in the way he suddenly couldn't seem to sit still. The service continued around us, but I was no longer listening. I was thinking about phone calls at odd hours, about the smell of unfamiliar perfume, about the way Richard had started working late with increasing frequency. I was thinking about the woman in the third row, about the way she'd watched the casket, about the way she'd disappeared the moment I'd noticed her. When the minister invited mourners to share memories of Michael, I found myself standing before I'd consciously decided to speak. The room fell silent, faces turning toward me with expectant sympathy. Michael was. I began, then stopped. What was Michael? My son, my heart, my reason for getting up in the morning? How could I possibly summarize 17 years of love in a few sentences? Michael was the best of me, I said finally. The best of us. And I refused to say goodbye to him without seeing his face one more time. A murmur went through the crowd. Richard's hand found my arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. Margaret, please, he whispered. Don't do this. But I was already walking toward the casket, my legs carrying me forward on autopilot. The funeral director stepped into my path, his expression apologetic but firm. Mrs. Winters, I really must advise against this. Given the circumstances of the accident. Move aside. I'm afraid I can't allow. He's my son. The words came out louder than I'd intended, echoing through the suddenly silent room. He's my son, and I want to see him. I could feel the weight of all those stares, could hear the whispered conversations starting behind me. But none of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the polished box in front of me, the brass handles gleaming in the overhead lights, the simple truth that my child lay inside and I hadn't seen him since the morning he'd kissed me goodbye. My hands found the edge of the casket lid. It was heavier than I'd expected, requiring more force than seemed right. But I was determined now, driven by a need I couldn't name or explain. Margaret, stop. Richard's voice was sharp with panic. You don't understand it. But I was already lifting the lid, already peering inside, already seeing. Nothing. The casket was empty. The satin lining was pristine, unmarked by any human presence. The small pillow where Michael's head should have rested was perfectly fluffed, untouched. The space where my son should have been was simply vacant. I stared into that emptiness, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Behind me, the room had erupted into chaos, gasps, shouts, the scraping of chairs as people stood to get a better view. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think. Where is he? I whispered. Richard was beside me now, his face white as paper, his hands shaking as he tried to close the casket lid. But I held it open, my grip surprisingly strong. Where is my son? Margaret, I can explain. Where is he? The funeral director was talking rapidly into his phone, his voice high with panic. The minister had stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. The mourners were pressing forward, their careful composure forgotten in the face of this impossible revelation. But I only had eyes for Richard, for the way he couldn't meet my gaze, for the way his shoulders sagged with what looked like defeat. He's not here, I said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. I know, and I'm sorry, but he's not here. The reality of it was starting to sink in, spreading through my chest like cold water. My son is not here. There were complications, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. With the preparation. They needed more time. Don't lie to me. I turned to face him fully, saw him flinch at whatever he found in my expression. Not now. Not about this. Don't you dare lie to me about this. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Around us, the funeral home had descended into chaos. People were talking over each other, demanding explanations, some pushing forward to see the empty casket for themselves. The funeral director was still on his phone, his voice growing more frantic by the minute. But in the center of it all, Richard and I faced each other across 17 years of marriage, across the empty casket where our son should have been, across a chasm of lies and secrets that seemed to grow wider with each passing second. Tell me the truth, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't name. Then, incredibly, he smiled, a small, sad expression that held no joy whatsoever. You want the truth? The truth is, I don't know where he is either. The funeral home emptied quickly after that. People scattered like leaves in a windstorm, some stopping to offer bewildered condolences, others fleeing as if the chaos might be contagious. Within an hour, the room that had been filled with mourners was empty except for Richard, myself, and the funeral director, who looked like he'd aged a decade in the space of an afternoon. I don't understand, he kept saying, his hands fluttering helplessly over his clipboard. I checked the preparation room myself this morning. Everything was ready. Everything was proper. Richard sat in the front row, his head in his hands. I remained standing beside the empty casket, my fingers gripping the edge of the lid so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. Where's my son? I asked again. The funeral director's phone rang. He answered it quickly, his voice hushed and urgent. I could hear fragments of the conversation: police, investigation, unprecedented situation. When he hung up, his face was grim. The authorities are on their way, he said. This is now well, it's a police matter. Police. Richard looked up, and I saw something flicker across his face. Fear? Relief? Why would they involve the police? Because bodies don't just disappear, Mr. Winters. There are protocols, procedures. A deceased person is accounted for from the moment they leave the hospital until they're interred. What happened here? It's not possible. But it had happened. I was staring at the evidence, the empty casket, the undisturbed satin lining, the complete absence of my child. Impossible or not, it was real. The police arrived 20 minutes later. 2 detectives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Detective Martinez, no relation to Michael's doctor, he assured us, was a compact man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that probably served him well in situations like this. His partner, Detective Coleman, was younger, more intense, with the sort of energy that suggested he was new to this kind of work. They interviewed us separately. Richard went first, escorted to a small office while I waited in the main room with Detective Martinez. He asked me to walk him through the morning, when I'd arrived, what I'd observed, who I'd spoken with. You mentioned seeing an unfamiliar woman during the service, he said, consulting his notes. Can you describe her? I told him about the woman in the third row, about her elegant appearance, about the way she'd watched the casket, about how she'd disappeared just before I'd opened it. And your husband seemed to recognize her? He said he didn't know what I meant. But he was lying. Detective Martinez looked up from his notepad. How can you be sure? Because I've been married to him for 17 years. I know when he's lying. The detective made another note. Is there anything else? Any other details that struck you as unusual? I thought about it, trying to remember details through the fog of grief and shock. The casket was heavy, I said finally. Heavy? When I opened it, it was heavier than I expected. If it was empty, shouldn't it have been lighter? Detective Martinez exchanged a glance with the funeral director, who had been hovering nearby. That's a good observation, Mrs. Winters. We'll look into that. When it was my turn to wait, I found myself alone in the viewing room. The empty casket sat open, its lid thrown back like a mouth frozen in a screen. I approached it slowly, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. Up close, I could see that the satin lining wasn't as pristine as I'd first thought. There were small indentations in the fabric, subtle creases that suggested something had been lying there. The pillow bore the faint impression of a head, the fabric slightly compressed despite its fluffed appearance. Someone had been in this casket. But who? And if it had been Michael, where was he now? I was running my fingers along the satin when I found it, a single strand of hair, dark and fine, caught in the fabric near where the head would have rested. It was too long to be Michael's, too dark to be mine. I plucked it free, holding it up to the light. It was a woman's hair. Mrs. Winters? Detective Coleman appeared beside me, his expression curious. Find something? I showed him the strand of hair. He examined it carefully, then produced a small evidence bag from his pocket. This wasn't here before? He asked, sealing the hair inside. No. At least, I don't think so. I didn't notice it when I first opened the casket. But you've been alone in here for the past 15 minutes. I looked at him sharply. Are you suggesting I planted evidence? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just trying to establish a timeline. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he was reassessing me. To him, I was just another grieving mother, potentially unstable, possibly unreliable. The thought should have angered me, but instead, I felt only a cold detachment, as if I were watching this scene from outside my own body. Have you spoken to my husband? I asked. Detective Martinez is interviewing him now. Why? Ask him about the woman in the third row. Ask him who she is and why he lied about knowing her. Detective Coleman made a note. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me? I almost mentioned the affair, the late nights, the growing distance between Richard and me. But what would be the point? My husband's infidelity had nothing to do with our son's disappearance. Or did it? No, I said finally. Nothing else. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. There was something else, something hovering at the edge of my consciousness like a half-remembered dream. Something important. I just couldn't remember what it was. Richard emerged from his interview looking haggard. Detective Martinez followed him out, his expression unreadable. We'll need to seal this room as a crime scene, he told the funeral director. And we'll need to examine your preparation facilities. Of course. Whatever you need. What happens now? I asked. Now we investigate. We'll check the hospital records, interview the staff who handled your sons, who were involved in the transfer. We'll find out what happened. How long will that take? Detective Martinez exchanged a glance with his partner. It's hard to say. This is an unusual situation. We'll be in touch as soon as we have more information. Richard and I drove home in silence. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, painting everything in golden light that seemed obscene in its beauty. How could the world look so normal when nothing would ever be normal again? We need to talk, Richard said as we pulled into our driveway. Yes, we do. Inside, the house felt different. The morning's flowers were still scattered on the kitchen floor, their petals brown and wilted. The sight of them made my chest tighten with a grief so sharp it was almost physical. I should have told you, Richard said, sinking into a kitchen chair. About the complications. What complications? The accident was bad. Worse than they told you. Michael's injuries were extensive. The funeral home said it would take extra time to make him presentable. So you knew the casket would be empty? I thought it would be. I hoped maybe they'd manage to, but when I saw it was empty, I wasn't surprised. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You let me plan a funeral for an empty casket? I thought it would be easier. Less traumatic. I was trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From saying goodbye to my son. From seeing him like that. Margaret, you don't understand. The injuries. Stop. I held up a hand. Just stop. I don't want to hear about his injuries. I want to know where he is. I want to know why you didn't tell me. And I want to know who that woman was. Richard went very still. What woman? The one in the third row. The one you recognized. The one you've been sleeping with. The words hung in the air between us like a physical thing. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, denial, resignation, and finally, something that might have been relief. How long have you known? He asked quietly. Months. Maybe longer. I didn't want to know, so I didn't ask. But now I'm asking. Who is she? And what does she have to do with Michael? She has nothing to do with Michael. Her name is Sarah. Sarah Chun. She works at the marketing firm we hired for the Henderson account. And she came to our son's funeral? I didn't invite her. I didn't even know she was there until you pointed her out. But you recognized her. Of course I recognized her. Margaret, I'm not proud of what I've done. I never meant for it to happen. It started as work meetings, and then what? You fell in love. Richard was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know anything anymore. I studied his face. This man I'd been married to for 17 years, this stranger who'd shared my bed and my life and my child. When had I stopped knowing him? When had he become someone who could lie so easily, who could bring his mistress to our son's funeral? I want you to leave, I said. Margaret, I want you to pack a bag and go stay with someone else. I can't look at you right now. He nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this. Okay, I'll go to my brother's. But Margaret, we need to work together on this. The police are going to have questions, and we need to present a united front. A united front? Our son is missing, Richard. His body is gone, and you're worried about our image? That's not what I meant. I meant we need to work together to find him, to get answers. I turned away from him, walked to the window that overlooked our backyard. The garden was overgrown, the roses we'd planted with Michael struggling against the weeds. Everything was dying, everything was falling apart. I don't know how to do that, I said. I don't know how to work with someone I don't trust. You can trust me about this. Whatever else has happened between us, I love Michael too. I want to find him too. Do you? I turned back to face him. Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been so busy with your new life that you forgot about your old one. Richard flinched as if I'd struck him. That's not fair. Fair. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Nothing about this is fair. Our son is dead, his body is missing, and you brought your girlfriend to his funeral. Fair doesn't exist anymore. He left an hour later, carrying a suitcase and wearing the same expression of guilty defeat I'd seen at the funeral home. I watched him drive away from the kitchen window, then turned back to the scattered roses on the floor. They were completely brown now, their petals soft and decomposing. I knelt and began gathering them up, one by one, placing them gently in the trash as if they were something precious. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the strand of hair I'd found in the casket. It had been long and dark, like Sarah Chen's hair, like the hair of the woman who'd sat in the third row, watching my son's empty casket with such intensity. But that was impossible. Sarah Chun had left before I'd opened the casket. I'd seen her go, hadn't I? I paused in my cleaning, trying to remember exactly what I'd seen. The woman in the third row had been there during the service, watching the casket. Then, during the prayer, she'd disappeared. But had she really left the building? Or had she simply moved to another part of the room? The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. The afternoon was starting to feel like a dream, events blurring together in ways that didn't quite make sense. The empty casket, the missing body, the woman who may or may not have been Richard's mistress. It was all impossible, but it was also real. I finished cleaning up the roses and washed my hands at the kitchen sink. In the window's reflection, I could see myself, pale, hollow-eyed, looking older than my 43 years. I looked like a woman who'd lost everything, which I supposed I had. But I also looked like a woman who was determined to find answers, no matter how impossible those answers might be. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick up. Mrs. Winters? This is Detective Martinez. I have some information about your son's case. I gripped the phone tighter. What kind of information? The kind that's better discussed in person. Would it be possible for you to come down to the station? Tonight, if you're able. Of course. Should I bring Richard? There was a pause. Actually, Mrs. Winters, I'd prefer to speak with you alone first. There are some things we need to discuss. After I hung up, I stood in my empty kitchen, surrounded by the silence of a house that had once been full of life. Whatever Detective Martinez had to tell me, I knew it would change everything. Again, I was getting used to having my world turned upside down. The question was, how many times could it happen before I lost my grip on reality entirely? I supposed I was about to find out. The police station at night was a different creature than during the day. The harsh fluorescent lights cast everything in stark relief, making shadows seem deeper and faces more angular. Detective Martinez met me at the front desk, his expression more serious than it had been that afternoon. Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Winters. I know this has been a difficult day. He led me through a maze of desks and office doors to a small conference room. 2 cups of coffee sat on the table, steam rising from their surfaces like spirits seeking escape. I need to ask you some questions, he said, settling into the chair across from me. And I need you to be completely honest with me, even if the truth seems impossible. Everything seems impossible now. I understand. Let me start with something concrete. The hospital records show that your son's body was released to Peaceful Rest Funeral Home at 2:30 p.m. yesterday. The funeral director, Mr. Garrison, signed for the transfer personally. Okay. The problem is, Mr. Garrison was in meetings with 2 other families yesterday afternoon. He has witnesses who can confirm he never left the building. And the driver who was supposed to make the pickup called in sick that morning. I stared at him. So who picked up Michael's body? That's what we're trying to figure out. The hospital's security footage shows a hearse arriving at the correct time, and someone in a funeral home uniform loading a body bag into the vehicle. But the image quality is poor, and we can't make out the person's face. What about the license plate? Registered to a vehicle that was reported stolen 3 days ago. It was found abandoned this morning in a Walmart parking lot, completely clean. No fingerprints, no DNA, no evidence of any kind. I felt the familiar sensation of reality shifting beneath my feet. You're saying someone stole my son's body? I'm saying someone took your son's body, yes. But Mrs. Winters, there's more. Detective Martinez opened a folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed the empty casket from this afternoon, but something was different about it. The satin lining looked disturbed, as if someone had been lying in it recently. This was taken after you opened the casket, he said. Do you notice anything unusual? I studied the image. The indentations I'd seen earlier were more pronounced in the photograph, and there was something else, a faint outline in the fabric, roughly human-shaped. Someone was in there, I said. That's what it looks like. But here's the thing. We had officers at the funeral home all afternoon, and no one saw anyone near that casket except you. What are you saying? Detective Martinez leaned forward. I'm saying that someone was in that casket between the time you opened it and the time we photographed it. Someone who left an impression but no other trace. I thought about the strand of hair, about the woman in the third row, about the way reality seemed to be dissolving around me like sugar in water. Have you found the hair I gave you? The one from the casket? We sent it to the lab for analysis. But Mrs. Winters, there's something else I need to tell you. Something about your son's medical records. He pulled out another file, this one thicker than the first. We pulled Michael's records from the hospital, going back several years. There are some inconsistencies. What kind of inconsistencies? According to these records, your son was admitted to the hospital 6 times in the past year. 6 times, Mrs. Winters. For various injuries, a broken arm, a concussion, severe bruising. The pattern suggests. Suggests what? Child abuse. The doctors noted their concerns in several reports, but no formal investigation was ever launched. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. Michael was never abused. He was never even seriously injured. Mrs. Winters, I need you to think carefully. 6 hospital visits in 1 year. Broken bones, head trauma. Your husband was listed as the emergency contact for all of them. Richard never hurt Michael. He might be a cheating bastard, but he's not violent. He's never laid a hand on either of us. Detective Martinez watched me carefully. The records show that you were present for only 2 of these visits. The others, your husband brought Michael in alone. I tried to process this information, but it felt like trying to hold water in my hands. I would have known. If Michael was being hurt, I would have known. Would you? Mrs. Winters, when was the last time you had a real conversation with your son? When was the last time you saw him without clothes, in a situation where you might notice unexplained injuries? The question hung in the air like an accusation. When had I last really looked at Michael? When had I stopped paying attention to the details of his life? I'd been so focused on Richard's affair, so consumed with my own pain, that I'd let my son become a stranger. This is impossible, I whispered. I'm his mother. I would have known. There's more. Detective Martinez pulled out another photograph, this one showing Michael's bedroom. But it wasn't the room I'd sat in the night before. This room was stark, empty, with bare walls and a single bed. No posters, no personal items, no signs that a teenager had ever lived there. This was taken this morning, Mrs. Winters. This is your son's room. I stared at the photograph, my mind rejecting what I was seeing. That's not his room. His room has posters, a computer, books. I was there last night. I held his elephant. What elephant? His stuffed elephant. Gray, worn, missing patches of fur. He's had it since he was 2. Detective Martinez made a note. Mrs. Winters, there was no elephant in that room. There were no personal items at all. The world was tilting again, sliding away from me like ice on a steep slope. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to anchor myself to something solid. I held it, I said. I remember holding it. I believe you remember that. But Mrs. Winters, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have you been taking any medication? Anything for anxiety, depression, sleep? No. I mean, sometimes I take something to help me sleep, but what kind of something? Pills. Richard gets them for me. He says they help with stress. Detective Martinez and I stared at each other across the table. In the silence, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of phones ringing, the steady tick of a clock on the wall. Mrs. Winters, I need you to think very carefully about what I'm going to tell you. Yesterday morning, you called 911 to report that your son had been in a car accident. When the paramedics arrived at your house, they found you unconscious on the kitchen floor, surrounded by broken glass and scattered flowers. No, the hospital called me. Dr. Martinez called to tell me about the accident. There is no Dr. Martinez at the hospital, Mrs. Winters. You were taken to the emergency room, where you were treated for a drug overdose. A combination of sleeping pills and alcohol. You were unconscious for 18 hours. That's not true. I was at home. I arranged the funeral. I spoke to the funeral director. You were discharged this morning into your husband's care. He brought you home, where you apparently became agitated and began talking about a funeral that never existed. I stood up so quickly that my chair fell backward. Stop. Just stop. This isn't real. My son is dead. His body is missing. I opened an empty casket this afternoon in front of dozens of witnesses. Mrs. Winters, please sit down. No, I won't sit down. I won't listen to this. Michael is dead. His funeral was today. You were there. You investigated the missing body. You have the hair I found in the casket. Detective Martinez stood as well, his expression gentle but firm. Mrs. Winters, there was no funeral today. There was no missing body. Your son Michael died 3 years ago. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. No, he died when he was 14, Mrs. Winters. In a car accident. You and your husband attended his funeral. You buried him at Greenwood Cemetery. No, no, no. I was backing toward the door, but Detective Martinez moved to block my path. The medical examiner's report showed that Michael had been systematically abused for months before his death. The injuries were consistent with repeated physical trauma. Your husband was arrested and charged with child abuse resulting in death. Richard is at his brother's house. I talked to him tonight. He packed a bag and left. Mrs. Winters, your husband, is in Millfield Correctional Facility. He's been there for 3 years. He was convicted of manslaughter in the death of your son. The room was spinning now, the fluorescent lights creating trails of light across my vision. I could feel my knees giving out, could feel gravity pulling me toward the floor. This isn't real, I whispered. This can't be real. I'm afraid it is. Mrs. Winters, you've been living alone for 3 years. According to your neighbors, you rarely leave the house. You've been subsisting on savings and your husband's life insurance policy. And you've been taking increasingly large doses of prescription medication. Strong hands caught me as I fell, guided me back to the chair. Detective Martinez's voice seemed to be coming from very far away. The pills your husband used to give you, they weren't just sleeping pills. They were antipsychotics, meant to help with the trauma of losing your son. But taken in large doses, combined with alcohol and isolation, they can cause severe dissociation and false memories. The woman, I said weakly. The woman in the third row. Sarah Chun. There was no woman, Mrs. Winters. There was no funeral. You spent today unconscious in your living room. When you woke up this evening, you called us about a missing body that never existed. I looked around the conference room, at the coffee cups that had grown cold, at the files spread across the table, at Detective Martinez's kind, patient face. Everything looked real. Everything felt real. But I remember, I said. I remember all of it. The funeral home, the empty casket, the people, Mrs. Henderson from down the street, the minister. False memories can feel completely real, especially when they're built around genuine grief and trauma. Your mind created a scenario where you could see your son one more time, where you could have the closure that was stolen from you. I closed my eyes, trying to sort through the tangle of memories and hallucinations. What was real? What was imagined? How could I trust my own mind when it had betrayed me so completely? The elephant, I said suddenly. Michael's elephant. I held it last night. Mrs. Winters, we found you this morning clutching a pillowcase. You'd been talking to it, treating it like it was something precious. A pillowcase. Not a beloved stuffed animal, but a piece of fabric that my damaged mind had transformed into a symbol of comfort. How long? I asked. How long have I been like this? Your neighbors say it's been getting worse over the past few months. They've heard you talking to yourself, seen you having conversations with people who weren't there. They were worried, but they didn't know how to help. I thought about the past few days, the memories that felt so vivid and real. The phone call about Michael's accident, the funeral arrangements, the confrontation with Richard. None of it had happened. All of it was the product of a mind that couldn't accept the truth. What happens now? I asked. Now you get help. Real help. There's a facility that specializes in cases like yours. People who've experienced severe trauma and developed dissociative disorders. They can help you separate the real memories from the false ones. They can help you process your grief in a healthy way. And if I refuse? Detective Martinez's expression was sympathetic but firm. Mrs. Winters, you're a danger to yourself. The overdose yesterday wasn't accidental, was it? You've been taking increasingly large doses of medication, mixing them with alcohol. If we hadn't found you when we did. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood. I'd been slowly killing myself, one pill at a time, one false memory at a time. My son really is dead, I said. It wasn't a question. Yes. I'm sorry. He died 3 years ago. And Richard really did hurt him. Yes. And I couldn't save him. Detective Martinez was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Winters, from what I've read in the case files, you tried. You called social services twice, but the reports were never followed up on. You took Michael to different doctors, trying to get help. The system failed you both. But I survived, and he didn't. Survivor's guilt is common in cases like this. It's part of what's been driving your dissociative episodes. Your mind keeps creating scenarios where you can save him, where you can see him again, where you can be the mother you couldn't be when he needed you. I sat in that sterile conference room, surrounded by the evidence of my own delusions, and felt something inside me finally break. Not the slow dissolution I'd experienced before, but a clean snap, like a bone finally giving way under too much pressure. Michael was dead. Had been dead for 3 years. I was alone, had been alone, would continue to be alone unless I found the strength to accept help. Okay, I said. Okay. I'll go. To the facility. I'll get help. Detective Martinez nodded. I think that's the right choice. Mrs. Winters, this isn't the end. With proper treatment, with time, you can learn to live with your grief instead of being consumed by it. Will I remember him correctly? The real Michael, not the one I've been imagining. That's something you'll work on with the doctors. Recovery isn't about forgetting. It's about learning to carry your memories without letting them destroy you. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. How do you carry the memory of a child's death? How do you live with the knowledge that you failed to protect the person you loved most in the world? One more question, I said. The hair in the casket. The strand I found. Was that real? Detective Martinez looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Winters, there was no casket. There was no hair. But I gave it to Detective Coleman. He put it in an evidence bag. There is no Detective Coleman, Mrs. Winters. I've been the only detective you've spoken with tonight. Another piece of my constructed reality crumbled away. Detective Coleman, the younger man with the intense energy, he'd been as imaginary as the funeral, as false as the empty casket. How much of today was real? I asked. Very little, I'm afraid. You woke up this evening and called us about a missing body. When we arrived at your house, we found you disoriented and talking about a funeral that never happened. That's when we realized you needed help. I closed my eyes and tried to picture my house as it really was. Empty rooms, dust-covered furniture, the remnants of a life that had stopped 3 years ago when my son died and my husband was sent to prison. I've been living like a ghost, I said. In a way, yes. But ghosts can learn to be human again, Mrs. Winters. It takes work, and it takes time, but it's possible. I opened my eyes and looked at Detective Martinez, the one real person in a day full of phantoms. Thank you, I said. For treating me like a person instead of a crazy woman. You're not crazy, Mrs. Winters. You're traumatized. There's a difference. Maybe there was. Maybe, with help, I could learn to see that difference myself. 6 months later, I sat in the garden behind Serenity Springs Treatment Center, watching the sun set through the trees. The roses here were different from the ones Michael and I had planted, hardier, bred for institutional landscaping rather than beauty. But they were still roses, and they still reminded me of that last morning, when the world had been normal and my son had been alive. Dr. Elizabeth Reyes joined me on the bench, carrying 2 cups of tea. She was younger than I'd expected when I first met her, with kind eyes and a gentle voice that never seemed to judge, no matter what truth I managed to excavate from the wreckage of my memory. How are you feeling today? She asked. Clearer. The memories are starting to separate themselves, the real ones from the constructed ones. It's like sorting through old photographs, trying to remember which ones were actually taken and which ones I just wished had been taken. That's progress. 6 months ago, you couldn't distinguish between them at all. I nodded, sipping the tea. It was chamomile, meant to be soothing, but I'd never much cared for it. Still, small preferences were returning to me, tiny pieces of personality that had been buried under layers of grief and medication. I've been thinking about the funeral, I said. The one I imagined. It was so detailed, so complete. Even now, knowing it wasn't real, I can still remember every moment. What do you think that funeral represented? The goodbye I never got to say. When Michael really died, I wasn't handling it well. The funeral was a blur. I was heavily medicated, barely conscious. I don't remember much of it. So your mind created a funeral where you were present, where you could participate in mourning your son, and where I could discover the truth about what happened to him. In the imagined funeral, I was the one who opened the casket. I was the one who found it empty. I was the mother who refused to be lied to. Dr. Reyes nodded. Your subconscious was trying to give you agency in a situation where you'd had none. In reality, you were powerless to save Michael. In the constructed memory, you were the detective, the one who uncovered secrets. But even in my fantasy, I couldn't save him. He was still dead. Still gone. Because even your traumatized mind couldn't entirely deny reality. You could change the circumstances, but you couldn't change the fundamental truth. I watched a robin hop across the grass, pecking at invisible insects. Life continuing, oblivious to human suffering. I had a visitor yesterday, I said. My sister drove up from Atlanta. She says she's been trying to reach me for months. How did that feel? Strange. Like meeting someone from a previous life. She told me about phone calls I don't remember, about offers to come stay with her that I apparently refused. It's like there's a whole other version of me who's been living in my body, making decisions I don't remember making. Dissociative episodes can last for extended periods, especially when someone is self-medicating. You were essentially sleepwalking through your own life. She brought pictures, I continued. Real pictures from Michael's real funeral. I'm in some of them, but I look vacant. Like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left just the shell. What did you think when you saw them? That I looked like someone who had given up. Someone who was already dead but hadn't had the courtesy to stop breathing. Dr. Reyes was quiet for a moment, letting that observation settle between us. And now, she asked. I considered the question. Now I feel like someone who might want to live again. Someday. Maybe. That's significant progress, Margaret. 6 months ago, you were actively trying to die. The pills. Yes. I remember now the real memory, not the constructed one. I've been increasing the dosage for weeks. That last morning, I took everything I had left. I wanted to join Michael. But you survived. But I survived. I turned to look at Dr. Reyes. Sometimes I'm not sure if that's a gift or a punishment. What do you think? I think it's a responsibility. Michael can't grow up, can't become the man he might have been. But I can still become the woman I might be. The woman I was before grief swallowed me whole. And who is that woman? I thought about it, trying to remember who I'd been before Richard's affair, before the abuse, before the accident that took my son's life. Someone who loved gardening. Someone who read mystery novels and made terrible puns that made Michael groan. Someone who believed in second chances and the fundamental goodness of people. Do you think that woman still exists? I don't know, but I'd like to find out. Dr. Reyes smiled. I think that's enough reason to keep trying. After she left, I remained in the garden as darkness fell. The treatment center had strict schedules, and soon I'd need to go inside for dinner and evening group therapy. But for now, I sat with the roses and the gathering night, trying to hold on to the fragile sense of hope that had been growing in my chest. I thought about the imaginary Detective Martinez, who'd been so kind and patient with a grieving mother's delusions. In creating him, my mind had given me exactly what I needed, someone who would listen, who would take my pain seriously, who would help me uncover the truth even when that truth was unbearable. I thought about the empty casket, and how even in my fantasy I hadn't been able to put my son inside it. Some truths were too large for even the most elaborate delusion to overcome. Most of all, I thought about Michael, not the 17-year-old I'd imagined, but the 14-year-old boy who'd died afraid and alone, who'd trusted me to protect him and whose trust I'd failed to honor. I'm sorry, I whispered to the darkening sky. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. The words felt different now than they had 6 months ago. Then, they'd been weighted with guilt and self-recrimination. Now, they were simply an acknowledgement of failure, clean and honest and final. Michael was dead. Richard was in prison. I was alone. But alone didn't have to mean dead. Alone could mean free to rebuild, free to become someone new, free to carry my son's memory without being crushed by it. It would take time. It would take work. There would be setbacks and bad days and moments when the weight of loss felt too heavy to bear. But I would bear it. For Michael, who would never have the chance to bear anything again. For the mother I'd been, who loved her son even when she couldn't save him. For the woman I might still become, if I had the courage to keep breathing long enough to find her. The stars were coming out now, pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. I stood and walked back toward the treatment center, toward the warm lights and the voices of other people learning to live with unbearable truths. Tomorrow I would wake up and the pain would still be there. Michael would still be dead. The past would still be unchangeable. But tomorrow I would also wake up, and that would be enough. For now, it would be enough. In the months that followed, Margaret Winters would continue her treatment at Serenity Springs. She would learn to distinguish between real memories and constructed ones, between healthy grief and destructive obsession. She would eventually return to her empty house and begin the process of making it a home again. She would plant new roses in her garden, not to replace the ones she'd shared with Michael, but to honor his memory while creating something new. She would donate Richard's belongings to charity and turn his study into a reading room. She would learn to sleep without medication and to wake without dread. Most importantly, she would learn to carry her love for Michael without being destroyed by it. The boy would remain forever 14 in her heart, forever lost, forever mourned. But his death would no longer be a cage that trapped her between past and present. The imaginary funeral, with its empty casket and impossible revelations, would fade but never entirely disappear. Sometimes, in moments of particular sadness, Margaret would remember the weight of lifting that casket lid, the shock of finding nothing inside. But she would also remember that even in her deepest illusion, her love for her son had been real. And in the end, perhaps that was enough truth to build a life on. The dead cannot be brought back. The past cannot be changed. But the living can choose, each day, whether to remain among the living or to join the dead in spirit if not in body. Margaret Winters chose to live. It was the most courageous thing she'd ever done.